Morning everyone, hope everyone's well and hope everyone's had a great weekend. Morning Ruby, Nico, Lily and Tanishka, good to see you online. So we're going to carry on with ecology. So this is part 5, we may make it to a part 6, we'll see how it goes. After this we're going to go on to another chemistry topic, but that will either be Wednesday or Friday, we'll start that one and we're going to be looking at chemistry 3. Morning Chris, morning Schlack, good to see you online. Fantastic. So we've been looking at food webs, we've looked at food chains, and we've looked at lots of the different keywords that go with it. More Naden, good to see you there as well. Fantastic, getting loads online today. Brilliant. So we've been looking at the keywords, we've been looking at sort of a lot of the words, some came up at key stage 2, some at key stage 3, some of them have been quite new. So a lot of you'll be fine with words like sort of producers and prey. But we've introduced a few more like sort of biodiversity, abiotic, biotic factors, and we've sort of started linking these in. Last lesson we looked at, I think we've looked at the carbon cycle, we've looked at, what did we go through last week? Hang on, I've got it here somewhere. Yeah, so we looked at the greenhouse effect, we looked at global warming, we looked at factors affecting decomposition, and actually why decomposition is really, really important. So we looked at quite a few different points like that. Today what we're going to do is we're going to sort of move on and have a look through the impact of humans, but not just humans, the impact of different environmental changes. We're then going to go through, we're going to go back to biodiversity and have a quick talk about that because it's really, really important that we fully understand that and the different things that can affect it. We're going to start talking about some different ways of managing the impact that humans have had. And then if we get time today, we'll sort of go and have a quick look at different uses of land, food production and farming techniques. But I've got a feeling some of that will come into Wednesday as well. So we've still got quite a bit to do. I think ecology, realistically, is probably one of the biggest topics. And we've only been doing sort of 45-minute lessons with them, so it takes a little bit longer to get through. So we may be up to 6 lessons on this. Let's make a start then. Now, when we start looking at the impact, so remember we've got these two keywords, we've got biotic and we've got abiotic. And we said when we look at the different conditions that affect how organisms live, that affect their habitat, that affect their environment, we can separate them into either living or non-living factors. So by living, we'd be talking about the amount of food available, we'd be talking about the predators, we might be talking about herbivores eating the different types of vegetation. We may be talking about disease, microorganisms as well. When we're talking about abiotic, we're talking about temperature, we're talking about oxygen levels, light levels, we might be talking about water availability, but basically any factors that will affect a population that is non-living. Now, if we sort of go through and have a look, and let me just copy in something from last lesson, because these were some of the factors that those of you that watched on Friday, I said to you things to think about would be this. Yeah, we said next time we're going to be looking at the impact of humans. And we said that these are the sort of different areas that we want to think about. So I'm going to drop another food web in a minute, and it'll be a sort of one that we're fairly familiar with. But we need to think about the impact that both we're having, but also the natural occurring. So let's have a look at a couple of examples with this. And I can't give you all of the answers to this because actually there are so many different ways that the exam board can put this into context that what we need to do is we need to try and use a bit of common sense with this one, but we also need to try and have a think about in the exam, you may want to do a quick mind map and jot down some ideas. Okay, so we'll look at some examples, but bearing in mind this is one of the topics that it could be very, very open-ended. And the exam board could realistically, on both the higher and the foundation paper, get you to apply your knowledge. So if we look at temperature, we already know that humans are increasing global warming. And we looked at what global warming is last time round. And we also said that global warming itself is not a bad thing. So the greenhouse effect actually manages to keep the temperature in Earth at a level where we can actually sustain life on this planet. Because without it, it'd be too cold for enzyme activity and most living things wouldn't be able to survive. Particularly plants, which we said are the producers, and they're responsible for producing the food sources that we now need. So global warming to a certain extent is quite important. What we've said though is that because we're increasing the greenhouse gases, so by that we're looking at carbon dioxide, we're looking at methane, and a few of the others as well. And we do these through human activities such as combustion, in sort of car engines, when we're making electricity, basically anything. Farming, cows produce vast amounts of methane. And if you think about the amount of cattle that we actually farm nowadays, that's a lot of methane going up into the air. So there's lots of different ways that we can produce more greenhouse gases than there would ordinarily be if we were not doing some of the activities that we now do. So yes, global warming is natural, but the argument is that most scientists now agree on is that we are pushing global warming past the point that it should be at, which is what's having these adverse effects. Now, we also know that actually global warming itself goes in cycles. So we've got global warming does actually happen in cycles. And if you look back through history, we have areas of very hot, and we also have the ice ages as well. So there is a naturally reoccurring cycle over tens of thousands of years where the temperature of the planet does naturally fluctuate. We can also look at this idea of seasonal change. Okay, so actually we know it gets colder in the winter, we know it's hotter in the summer, depending on where you are. So actually, when we look at a lot of this, some of these changes don't necessarily have to be long-term, and some of them don't have to be man-made. Because if we look at seasonal changes, we know that plants will often die back in the winter. We know that certain trees will lose their leaves and the sap will sink. But we also know then that certain animals will migrate. So if we look at birds, they'll change their habits, they'll go to different areas. Some animals will go into hibernation. So actually we can look at the seasonal changes, and we can look at the effects this is going to have. If we took birds, for instance, if you were doing a population sample of certain birds in the winter compared to in the summer, you would expect a much higher population in the summer. Because of the temperature changes, a lot of those birds will migrate. So if we were looking at the UK population of some of these, the population would be quite low. So it's really important when you're looking at your population surveys that we're taking these sorts of things into account. It might not necessarily be they're endangered. It might just mean that we haven't actually got any around. Same thing, for instance, if animals were in hibernation, you can imagine if you were trying to do a population survey of maybe something like rabbits in the winter, you probably wouldn't get as many as you do in the summer. Also, if you look at the population survey in the spring, when the rabbits are breeding quite heavily, you would probably find a much higher population than as the time goes on and the predators have had a chance to breed and actually start hunting some of those prey as well. So all of these factors are going to be affected, and we need to take into account when we're sort of trying to discuss this. And hopefully this shouldn't be anything too complicated. It's just a case of applying what we know to some different circumstances. We can put light on here as well, because actually it's worth bearing in mind certain parts of the world. So for instance, when I went to Finland a few years ago, we were sort of canoeing in the summer, and it didn't really get that dark even in the summer. It sort of got a little bit darker, but not to the state where you never need a torch to see where you were going. And that was only for a couple of hours. By about 3 o'clock in the morning, it was bright sunlight again. So some parts of the world, they actually have sunlight all through the summer, but then in the winter, they have pretty much no sunlight at all. So they'll have darkness pretty much all the way through the winter. So you can look at the effects of those natural changes on the plants, for instance, because very realistically, you are not going to get much plants growing in the winter, even if it wasn't cold, because we have no natural sunlight for that period of the year. So it's just something else to be taken into account when we're looking at. Just bring that back up again as well. So we've looked at sort of gases and how they might change. If we're looking at air, and if we're sort of talking about gases as well, you may want to think a little bit more localized, like greenhouses. Because actually, if we wanted to increase plant growth in a localized area, you can actually deliberately provide more CO2 in a way that's not going to escape, so that you can actually increase the rate of photosynthesis. So that doesn't necessarily have to be global warming, or on a global scale, that could also be localized as well. Again, if we look at water, we could be looking at droughts, which could be seasonal. Obviously, we end up with a lot more rain at certain times of the year, depending on, so we could be looking at weather as well. And I'm deliberately putting some of the natural factors in that can affect, rather than just the man-made ones. But we can consider the man-made as well, because actually if we start looking at the melting ice caps, we can then look at the availability of water. And as we said last week, as the ice caps melt, not so much in, I always get this the wrong way around. I think the Arctic doesn't make a great deal of difference. It's the Antarctic. Because the Arctic, the ice caps themselves are floating, so they're all icebergs. Whereas on the Antarctic, the ice is above land. So you know for a fact if you put an ice cube in water, and you can try this at home, if you were to measure the volume of water, total water, including the ice cube before, even though the ice cube's sitting above it, because the ice is displacing water, when it melts again, the overall volume of the water doesn't change. So actually in the Arctic, if the ice caps melt, apart from the loss of all the life that lives there, it won't create a great deal of difference to the sea levels. But if you look at the Antarctic, because the ice is all sitting on top of land, rather than displacing water, all of that water then goes into the sea, which causes the sea levels to rise. So we can look at that again. And as we said, we've got mass flooding, we've got loss of life, we've got areas of land that we just don't have. So we can look at the availability of water. And again, we're looking at natural and we are looking at man-made. And these are the sort of factors that we need to think about. We can look at geographical. We know that the temperature changes quite majorly depending on where you go. If you look in sort of mountainous areas, you're going to get very different weather patterns to if you're looking at desert. The same thing with the Arctic. So we can actually look and sort of link in geographic factors to a lot of this as well. I'm just going to drop a food web in, and just give you a few examples with biodiversity. And then we'll go and have a look at some other human factors that we can link in, and sort of start looking at some of the farming as well. So let me just drop in the same food web that we've been looking at before. We go back to here. I'm using the same one. Thank you, WikiHow, because it's just really good. As I said before, we've got the bacteria in. Now, what we need to think about is if we were to look at the factors affecting this biome, so this is one particular environmental niche, this is the sort of habitat of the ecosystem they live in, we think straight away with the desert, we've got hot days, we're going to have cold nights, we're going to have dry, we're going to have little water, and we can go through and we can have a look at all of these factors. And these are sorts of things you can do for any particular biome or ecosystem that you can think of. Now, all of these species will be adapted to this particular environment. But actually, we end up with a very, very balanced ecosystem. Now, biodiversity, as we know, is one of the biggest sort of key words here. And it just means that we have the largest range of organisms that we possibly can. And what that does is add balance to the food web, because it means if one of the numbers gets affected, the population of the other species should be able to take some of the pressure off, so that we don't end up with a mass extinction of different populations. Now, if we were to kill off several of these, then yes, we would have some quite big issues. But what you should be able to do is make changes to one particular part and then follow it through and identify with even species that maybe don't seem linked and look at what effect that's going to have. And I'll give you an example, and then I'll let you sort of spend some time in your own time going through and maybe looking at others. So we were talking about some diseases such as the Dutch elm disease, which is sort of affecting a lot of the elm trees around the UK. So let's say, for instance, and let's just do this in a different colour. Let's just say, for instance, that we've got, I'm going to just put, in fact, let's just put example. A random disease reduces the cacti population. So what we're going to do is we're going to eliminate these cacti, or the vast majority of them. Now we can pick, with the exception of possibly the bacteria, because they may not have the most effect, we can pick any of these and we can sort of have a look at what the effect is going to be. Now, if we were to take maybe the lizard, for example, then we should be able to see that actually we've taken a food source away from the cacti, away from the grasshopper. Now, if there's not enough grass to feed the grasshopper, then the population for the grasshopper would decrease, which means there's not as much food for the lizard, so the population of the lizard would also go down. So these are sorts of things we need to take into account. Likewise, if we were then to say, actually, because there's no cacti, there's going to be more grasshopper feeding on the grass. So the population of the grass is going to go down, which means there's potentially less food for the rabbits. So the rabbit population is going to decrease. If there's less rabbits, then there's going to be less food for the hawks. So the hawk population could decrease, which might mean the lizards aren't being hunted as much. So the lizard population could go up. Now, the lovely thing about this in the exams, if any question in the exam could be considered lovely, is the fact that there isn't a right or wrong answer to it. Whatever you put down, as long as you can justify why you think that, is going to get you the marks. Generally, what they'll say is there's no marks without a justification with this one. Morning, Grace. Morning, Capri. Made it out of bed then. So the major thing with this one is that there isn't a right or wrong answer. You just have to be able to justify your answers. So we'll go for the extreme, I suppose, and let's have a look at something like the sort of tarantula here. And look at actually how can the population of the tarantulas be affected if the cacti population went down. We can sort of follow this through again. So we know that actually the grasshoppers aren't going to have as much food. So let's just say that the grass population decreased. This means that there possibly either wasn't as many rabbits, or the rabbits were overfeeding on the star cacti, which means the population of that's going to go down as well. Should we do it that way? Or no, okay, let's just say there's less rabbits, which means there's going to be less rabbits feeding on the star cacti, so the star cacti goes up. This means my kangaroo rat has more food, so the population of that's going to go up. So there's more food for the tarantula, so the tarantula population could go up. So straight away, we've looked at an effect of something that's not directly linked. And you can do this all day. You can literally go, what if? And that's pretty much what this game is. It's just going, okay, if I go and do something to these ones, what happens to everything else? And you just go, what if, and work your way through. Feel bad for the kangaroo rat? Yeah, I mean, we could actually go through something else with this one. Let's just have a quick look then. Let's just say that the grasshoppers were eating all the grass. So the rabbit population decided to overeat the star cacti, so the star cacti went down. That means there's now no longer any food for the kangaroo rats. They're going to starve out. This means there's less food for the tarantulas, so the tarantula population goes down. So we can look at it that way as well. We could also then sort of link it all the way through, and you can end up going round and round in circles with this. We can say there's now less food for the rattlesnakes. That's going to go down as well. But this means the lizard population is going to go up, which means my grasshopper population, and you can end up literally working your way around. And like I said, it doesn't make any difference whether you're right or wrong, as long as you can just give examples for it. Okay? So that's with this one. But as you can see, the more food sources we've got, the more chance of everything else surviving. Okay? So that's where this all comes in. Yeah, sorry, it does mean that the kangaroo rat can't hurt you, Aidan, because he's completely harmless. So go through. If you, as I've said before, will this work? As I said before, go through, grab any food web you like, and just go through and kill off one of the populations of the different species, and just work out what happens to all the other ones. Or do the other extreme and say the population of the kangaroo rats goes up. They have a particularly good year. They had loads of food sources. So the population of the kangaroo rats goes massively up. What happens to everything else? Okay. And straight away, what we should be able to say is actually, we get rid of the star cacti and then we can start working our way through. Cameron, you should know by Aidan that my jokes aren't particularly good by now. Right. Let's move on to another topic. Oh, they get worse as well. Don't worry. Right, so a couple of things to have a think about then, and this is quite a small part in the actual specification. It's quite a small part in the specification, but I suppose it's probably one of the biggest areas now, and that's waste management. So we'll move on and have a look at this bit. Come on, you only come here for the bad jokes. So, oh, actually, it's all right. Just while we're here and going completely off topic, this has to be the best mug in the world. Okay. Grumpy. Absolutely brilliant. Pause that and have a read of that later on. Anyway, moving on. Let's have a look at waste management. So, what we're looking at trying to do is we're trying to reduce certain forms of pollution. And we can separate this into water, air and land. Now, some of this will come up in the chemistry topics as well. Ah, yeah, brilliant mug. Suits me as well, particularly in the morning. Completely grumpy before I had any caffeine. So, we can separate it into 3 areas. And like I said, some of it comes up in chemistry as well. I know water quality will come up, particularly in chemistry, when we're looking at treating different types of waste, and also air quality as well. So I'm not going to spend hours, because I could literally do an entire lesson just on these 3. When we're talking about waste management, though, something that comes up in primary school, and most of you should be aware of it, if we're trying to reduce the amount, or trying to deal with the amount of waste we have, we can look at the waste hierarchy. So we've got this idea of reduce, reuse, recycle. Generally after that, we will end up with burn, because actually we can recover the energy from that before we end up with landfill. Landfill really should be the last resort. And we still put way too much waste into landfill. Yeah, caffeine to some extent. We'll come back to that one, Aidan. That's a bit of a discussion later. We won't do that one now, because there's arguments for and against that one. Anyway, when we're looking at this one, reducing the amount of waste that we have to start with is the first thing we need to do. If you go to the supermarket, it's amazing how much just waste packaging you have from the things we buy. And if you start making a conscious effort, it doesn't take much to actually reduce the amount we have. So that should be the first goal for pretty much all of us at the moment, is just reducing the sheer amount of waste that we're actually producing. The second thing is reusing. Actually, if you go and have a takeaway and it comes in those plastic tubs, why would you bin them away afterwards when you've now got storage containers that you can wash up that you can use in the future? Things like egg cartons, then you can actually use them for a lot of other things, including growing plants in, because you end up making biodegradable flower pots. So there's things that we can actually try and reuse and upcycle. Let's get back to the topic, guys. Let's get off the tea and coffee. So, yeah, recycling and upcycling should be the next step with this one. Because actually, by doing that, what we're then doing is, again, we're stopping the waste that's working its way back down this hierarchy. Because everything below reuse has an energy implication. So, yes, recycling is great, but all of this one, I'm just going to put down here, has an energy and pollution implication. The implications of reduce and reuse is pretty much minimal, okay? So we've got this idea of reduce, reuse. Recycling then is where we actually go and we take a material and we do something with it. So I've got, as some of you will know, I bought a 3D printer at the start of the lockdown, and I've been printing all sorts of things. But actually, some of what I print ends up just not working. So the plastic itself, I could just throw it in the bin. But actually what you can do is you can reuse it, you can remelt it down, you can redo other things with it. And what we do find is a lot of the bottles, a lot of the materials that we put into recycling bins, that will get sorted into different plastic types, into different metal types. It will get remelted down, or it will get reprocessed, so it can be reused for different things. But if you think about the cost of trying to melt things back down again and reuse it, we still have to put energy in, which is why there is still an increase in pollution. Okay, so that's just something to consider. If we can't recycle it, a lot of different types of waste material we can actually then burn. And when we burn them, although we get the gases that get given off, which will increase pollution levels, we can actually use the energy to heat water to generate electricity. So it's not as bad. The worst problem is, come on guys, back on topic, otherwise I have to close down the chat. The next thing we have then is when we start looking at landfill. Landfill does absolutely nothing apart from, in the worst case scenario, leaking toxins into the soil, polluting the soil. And some of these can take decades and decades to actually break down into anything else. And during that time, all it is doing is contaminating. So landfill really is the last resort. So we need to make sure that we're aware of these and why this waste management hierarchy actually exists. Okay, so make sure you're aware of it and make sure that you can talk about each of these. So water pollution, key ones we're looking at is pH, and that could be from acid rain. Remember, acid rain itself would actually come from a source of air pollution. So when we're looking at the air, we've got acid rain. And we'll cover this in one of the chemistry topics later on. But generally, acid rain is from combustion when we produce CO2, sulfur dioxide, and then various nitrogen oxide compounds. We end up producing very dilute nitric acid. And does sell sulfuric acid. Honest. And carbonic acid, which then dissolves into the rainwater, making the rainwater slightly more acidic. Of course, that can then go into the water systems, which, we create acid rain. Now, rainwater itself is very slightly acidic because of the carbon dioxide in the air anyway, but there's not very much carbon dioxide. But if you go into cities where you have lots of pollution being produced either from local factories or from the cars, the gases that are given out make the rainwater there a lot more acidic than you would normally have it, which means when it goes into the water systems, it drops the pH, which can kill off plants, it can kill off fish. So we can link all this back to, if we were to look at the food web for those particular areas as well, because actually if we start killing those off, we can actually have a massive effect on quite a large part of the food chain. I mean, realistically, if we were to talk about, and let's just see if I can do this quickly, if we were to look at a food web for a lake, let's just see if I can find one. Where are we looking? Okay, this would be one from an American lake. But if you can imagine, if we look at this one here, realistically, if we have some of these that are sensitive, such as mayfly nymphs, I know they're particularly sensitive. Some of these other sort of invertebrates and some of these fish, we could effectively, with enough acid rain, eliminate half of the food web, which means straight away, if we do that, we don't actually end up with, we lose all of that biodiversity and we lose all of the security in the food web straight away. Okay. So yeah, acid rain, really, really bad. Not only that, is it will also can kill off trees. It can change the pH of the ground. And actually, it can start dissolving manhole covers. It can start affecting buildings as well. So acid rain is quite a key thing. Land pollution, we're generally looking at pollution of soil. So this could be pH. This could also be heavy metals, because actually they're toxic to most creatures and to humans as well, and to animals as well. So if we get too many of those leaching in, and a lot of that will come from landfill. What else can we have in there? We can have other various chemicals. Head's in the way. Hang on. There we go. Let's move it over that way. Shall I make my head smaller? You don't need to see my head much anyway. Let me just shrink that down. There you go. That should be better for you. Okay. So with all of these, it's just worth going through and working out what would the implications be. And like I said, it is just that so what. This is then most of the science explanations are. If you're doing a series of bullet points rather than waffling with a big paragraph, You can literally put a statement going and say humans have done this. Then you think, well, so what? Well, the next bullet point is what effect would that have? Okay, let's just move on a little bit with this then. What time have we got? 1:30. Brilliant. Right. Let's move that out of the way. You don't need to see that. So we're going to go through and we're going to have a look at some land uses. And what I might do, I might even stick with ecology for this week, and I might put some actual case studies in later on. But we'll see how it goes. Like with those of you that are doing geography, there's massive, massive overlaps with all of this. So some of this won't be new, or you will cover it in geography as well, which actually makes your life easier because it means you don't have to learn the same thing twice. Because actually, although you don't both lessons, you can just use it as a revision class. So there's less content to learn. Right, if we're looking at land use then, you could do this as a mind mapping exercise of trying to think about what do we use land for. So obviously we've got things such as buildings and cities, farming. We could have, let's just put national parks. Oh, history is just learning the lies, Aidan. It's only written by the winners. So I'd rather learn the facts from science. Okay, so don't. I spent way too many times winding up history teachers with that. So buildings, farming, we've got national parks. What else do we use it for? Quarrying. Let's put national parks and leisure. And let's look at transport. Okay, so if we start going through and we're having a look at these ones, we've got, and there's probably other ones as well, but these are the different effects or different uses that humans are using the land for. And all of these will have an effect on the environment. I mean, if you think about sort of buildings and transport, what these are doing is actually decreasing available natural land. So actually, when you start having a look at it then, we have less trees, we have less plants, we have less vegetation. National parks, in some respects, will actually preserve some of the land, but every time that humans walk through that land, they're going to have an effect on it as well. Which is why, actually, what we should be doing whenever we go places like that, and those of you that came up the last DV hike, I'm quite keen on trying to teach people to follow the footpaths. Because when we follow the footpaths, we're not destroying all the land either side of it as well. So it's quite key to actually go through, and we can have a look at looking at the effects on that one. Transport itself, we know we've got the pollution. We've also got the destruction of land. Okay, so we can have a look at the effects and the implications of that. Morning, Raoul. Quarrying, what are the effects of quarrying? Well, we can have a look at the pollution. I mean, with this one, we have, again, massive amounts of destruction, which is really bad with this one. We have the pollution that goes with it as well, particularly with the processing afterwards. And some of that pollution will come from the processing, but also the transport. Okay, so I'm not going to go through loads of this, but it's really important that one of the things you can do is actually have a look at the negative and the positive effects on some of these. So let's have a look, for instance, if we look at quarrying, some of the positive effects on this one is it provides jobs, and it also brings in money into the local economy. So yes, we're going to end up with lots of destruction of the land, but it's then going to help the people that are living locally for that one. Farming, again, will provide money for the farmers. It will provide food, and we'll have a look at farming a little bit more in a minute. On the downside for this, though, is we're actually changing land uses. And we could also have chemicals leaking into soil. We could have methane production from the cattle. So we've got other things as well. If you have a look at the New Forest, I mean, the New Forest I've spent many, many hours in and absolutely love it. But the New Forest itself, humans have deliberately changed the purpose into what it is now. It never used to be heathland as it is. It used to be a vast area of woodland, which is why it was actually called the New Forest. And actually, when you go and have a look, you can actually go and find the evidence of ancient hunting lodges where previous kings would have used it for vast amounts of hunting. And then due to human activity, we've actually gone through and changed the land. So, yeah, not necessarily though, Nico. We don't necessarily have to destroy it, but we can change some of the uses and we can minimise the impact. As we go through, you'll have a look, actually, the human population itself has got huge. So a lot of what we are looking at the moment, don't worry if you can't watch the stream quite now, you can always come back and watch it later on. It will be recorded on here, okay? So if you can't watch it now, come back, drop the quality down if you need to, and you can always watch it a little bit later on. Cool. So yeah, Nico, with a lot of this, yes, there is negatives, but there's also positives. And what I'm trying to do is trying to give you a bit of a balance with it as well. For instance, with the pollution, with the transport, yes, we have pollution destruction of the land, and the pollution can come from both the production of the transport routes, but also from the use of cars. However, hang on, let's go back to what it can also do is increase the availability of leisure, which is going to increase fitness, mental health. It can also mean that we can then transport more of the local goods, so we don't need to transport more internationally, which can decrease the pollution from those particular areas. And it can connect us quite a lot as well. So with all of this, try and see the positives and the negatives with the different land uses. Something that comes up particularly with when we're looking at this, and I'm just going to brown just because it's the colour of what I'm about to talk about, is when we look at peat bogs. So I know Grace is online at the moment. Grace was saying that she's been growing some vegetables in some of the recent talks. Grace, did you use compost? I'll keep talking while I wait to see if the answer comes through. But one of the problems with a lot of compost, depending on where you get it from, is a lot of compost often contains peat. Okay? Now, you can get peat-free compost, and that's absolutely fine, but a lot of it contains peat. So peat as with any compost, it's basically the remains of dead plants that have basically been rotted down and decomposed. Now, whenever you put your hands in soil, you literally have the sort of inorganic material, so the sand, the clay, and the other things as well, but plants can't live on that. But you've also got that rotted down remains of all the dead animals and plants. So, and that's just one of the things we do when we're dealing with soil and if we're growing compost. Now, with peat bogs, we've got the remains. Oh, hang on, let me just go back. We've got the remains. But because of the conditions, we have very low levels of oxygen and we have quite low pH. So actually, the soil itself is quite acidic. Now, what that means is that we can't actually, it doesn't sustain, hang on. There's not very much bacteria that can actually live there because the conditions just don't favour the bacteria. So peat bogs themselves have taken many, many hundreds of years to actually form, thousands of years in a lot of cases. We've got these rotted down remains of animals and plants, and the bacteria themselves can't fully decompose it because they can't survive because of the actual conditions. Yeah, Shellac, we're exactly the same. Horse poo is absolutely great because it's quite high in nitrates and it doesn't actually come from the peat bogs. The problem we've got with the peat bogs, and this is where the negative effects come in. Let's go into red for a minute. As soon as it's dug up, if we go when dug up, oxygen enters. So as soon as you dig up the peat, oxygen enters, bacteria start to flourish, which means the peat starts to decompose and the CO2 is released. Okay? So straight away, as soon as you physically dig up that peat, it's going to start decomposing and it's going to start releasing CO2. So peat, a bit like fossil fuels, is a carbon sink. And as soon as you do anything with it, it straight away starts releasing CO2 into the atmosphere, which is why a lot of people now will try and use peat-free compost. The other thing we have is that peat bogs themselves are an endangered ecosystem. So a lot of the plants and animals and species that live on them can only live in those areas. So as we dig them up, we're actually endangering those animals as well. Another use, just while we're putting the uses down, I'm just going to different colours just so you can see the different uses. Some parts of the world, in the UK, so I know Ireland do it quite heavily, some parts of Dartmoor will actually burn peat for a fuel. So they dig it up, they dry it, and they burn it, okay? Come on, guys, let's focus on the chat. I'm going to finish in about 3 minutes with this one, and then I'm going to go on to Google Classroom. So if you've got any questions, jump on here, but let's just get this last bit finished before we move on. So yeah, a lot of people will burn peat, so they dig it up, it stinks, it's really vile to smell, although you can always tell if you're going into an area that burns peat because of the smell. So again, that's going to increase the CO2, and it's also going to damage the environment with that. I can show you what peat environments look like. Let me just go on to here for a second. So if you go into these sort of particular areas, I mean, like I said, I've spent quite a lot of time in Dartmoor. I've been to see some of these in Ireland. And you actually get, it's quite a bleak environment, but you end up with a very, very particular ecosystem. So as you're looking through, what they found is that actually the locals, because they had lots of peat, they will dig it up. And this is actually what they do. They dig it up like here. And then each of these will dry out and they can burn these in the fuel. They reckon there's a pub on Dartmoor and you can go and check this particular pub any time of the night and day. And the fire, there's been some naturally underground gases that have been burning from the peat as it slowly does decompose. And this fire has been burning for hundreds of years. But yeah, you end up with these particular ecosystems, which as we dig them up, just gets damaging. But it is actually quite beautiful, and it's, like I said, I quite like spending quite a bit of time out here. But as we dig them up, we are increasing the CO2 content in the atmosphere, and we're also destroying this landscape. Some of the interesting things they have found then, and I'll just put this up here, is, if I wonder if this one would come up. They found some of these remains in almost pristine condition. So, and it's not just humans as well. I think, have they got animals? Let's just change woman to animals. What they found is, or animal remains, they found some sort of historic species from thousands of years ago that are almost completely preserved because they can't decompose. They fall into these peat bogs. The peat bogs have gone over the top of them, and because there's very low bacterial content, they can't decompose. So we've actually gone through and found the remains in almost perfectly preserved. The problem is, as soon as you dig it up and get the bacteria and the oxygen onto it, they start decomposing very rapidly indeed. So what's the time? About 1:45. So that's about me done. Let me just go through, because I've done quite a few different areas today, and let's just do a quick recap on what we've actually covered today. So we started off, we looked at some of the factors and the impact of humans, and we went through sort of environmental, we looked at natural effects as well, but we looked at some of the factors that can affect different species on Earth. We went and had a look at a food web, and we said that actually the bigger the food web, the higher the level of biodiversity, and the higher the level of biodiversity, the more secure the food web is. But we had a look at the effect of population changes on different parts of the food web. We've then got through and spoken about waste management and why waste management is important. And we started looking at pollution and how pollution can actually affect the landscape as well. And again, the effect on different ecosystems. And we finally come back and had a look at land uses. And we've spoken about some of the ways that we can use land, the positives and the negatives. And we said that actually I haven't given you all the answers to this one because there's a lot of different things that you can put down. But the key thing is actually you can choose any of these in your own time and just go through and write a 6-mark question on evaluating the land use. How are national parks good? How are national parks bad? Why is quarrying good? Why is quarrying bad? We also said that you can have a look at, we also looked at peat bogs, and we actually had a look at why are peat bogs good for the environment? Why should we not dig them up? Why do we dig them up, and what do we use them for? So those are about all the different things that we've looked at today. Now, what I'm going to go and have a look at next time is we're going to go and have a look at deforestation and some of the effects on the environment for that. We're then going to go and have a look at food production, and we're going to look at different farming techniques, the advantages and the disadvantages on that one. And if we get time, we'll have a look at sort of biotechnology, genetic engineering, mycoproteins and insulin as well. But if not, we'll come back to that on Friday. As always, I'm going to jump onto Google Meet. So there'll be a link put in Google Classroom in a few minutes. Pop on, say hello. Or if you've got specific questions, ask those as well. But it'd be good to see some of you there and just let me know how you're getting on. So hopefully I'll see you on Google Meet in a few minutes. Just refresh the Google Classroom in about 3-4 minutes time, and there should be a link appear under today's lesson. Okay? Hope everyone's well, and I'll speak to you Wednesday. Bye-bye.